It's the Harris Football Podcast with your host, Christopher Harris.
Welcome. Welcome in. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here. I am Chris Harris. This is the Harris Football Podcast. Wanted to thank footballguys.com. I appeared on the Audible podcast, a full hour interview with Sigmund Bloom. And thanks also to the Fantasy Footballers, another really good fantasy football podcast. It was fun to talk running backs with those guys. Both of those shows I've linked to in my Twitter feed, at Harris Football, and of course you can find them on iTunes. Well, the little podcast that could apparently has its first true meme as the sightings of me continue to pour in unabated. Patty Cronin emails, heyharris at harrisfootball.com. Tonight, after I returned from the bathroom, my housemate swore Christopher Harris broke in through the front door of the house and took a massive bite of my Hot Pocket and left via the window, disappearing into thin air. I'm going to guess it was the roommate, but it was delicious. Thomas Morgan tweeted, at Harris Football again, "Don't worry, I know of a few safe houses when you make your return to Austin. Hashtag straight out of Texas." And Booger the Bulldog, one of our old favorites, is super psyched to hear this development. He says, "So all I have to do to get my voice on the podcast is stalk you in bars? As a bona fide booze hound, I'm in." And indeed, that's true, Booger. Because in case you missed it yesterday, we actually have a real-life, actual phone number. That's a Chris Harris hotline for the sightings that you make of me as I infiltrate your lives. And this came in last night.
I saw Chris Harris in my bed last night.
That was it. I didn't cut that off. That's all that was left. I wanted to hear more, I have to say. You're welcome. It's a real phone number. You can leave a real message for your sightings. It is 786-529-2484. Numbers that you do not need to remember because it spells out on your keypad, "Sunk by a Hug." Give us a call. Sunk by a Hug.
Today's kickoff.
And today we'll have a few quick player notes, and then this is the first of two parts, Thursday and Friday. I'm going to count down my 10 swing players for 2015. In other words, players who we don't exactly know how it'll play out for them. They might go crazy and win your league, or they might really disappoint considering where you draft them. We'll also have a music digression, and I got a great suggestion from Joel Kotler on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter, at Harris Football. Joel suggested making a list of the music digressions on our website, and we're going to effort that as soon as possible. And then finally, we'll have Sigmund Bloom from footballguys.com as a guest to talk about his swing players for this season. So let's get into it. Some quick player news. I didn't mention the perils of Geno Smith yesterday. As you know, Geno did the jetsiest thing he could a couple days ago, which was getting into a locker room fight and getting his jaw broken. He'll miss 6 to 10 weeks, which means he won't play in the opener, and Ryan Fitzpatrick will be the starter. Fantasy-wise, probably about a wash for players like Brandon Marshall and Eric Decker and Jay Samaro. Geno isn't good. Fitzpatrick is a different kind of not so good. He'll take big chances. He's a gunslinger. He's going to make a bunch of mistakes, but he can produce the occasional big game. We've certainly seen it in his travails around the NFL. Bottom line is, I didn't change my ranks of any Jets players as a result of this. T.Y. Hilton reportedly signed an extension with the Colts, which is a little bit surprising because it did seem like they spent their first rounder this year on a Hilton clone in Philip Dorsett, but it's obvious Hilton is a deep weapon, and Andrew Luck loves him, so this is good news all around. Chris Johnson and Pierre Thomas are still considering offers and probably waiting for more than the minimum. And having lost Sean Sweezum in the season's first preseason game, the Steelers went with Garrett Hartley as their kicker, which means Hartley deserves top 10 consideration for whatever that's worth kicker-wise. Though, of course, when he was kicking for New Orleans' great offense, Hartley always seemed to have a way to screw that up too. All right, so let's get to this list of swing players in reverse order. I'm going to go from the least swingy to the most swingy, I guess. Number 10 on my list of the players who could make or break your season, and it's very difficult to know which will happen, is Todd Gurley, the Rams rookie running back. The misinformation age has found the perfect fantasy football player for 2015. If you listened to our Dynasty theme podcast last week, you know I love Gurley's career prospects. For me, he's the best running back prospect since Adrian Peterson. Of course, though, he tore the left ACL in November, and it would take a Peterson-sized comeback for Gurley to be ready week 1. Still, if you Google Gurley's knee, I like that. That should be a band name. Somebody needs to start a band name called Gurley's Knee. If you Google his knee, you'll see many, many stories, beat reporters, writers breathlessly saying, one day, he looks great, and another day, the Rams expect him to be ready. Lately, though, you're reading some sanity. Now, it seems like people are reporting the Rams are pretty much publicly admitting Gurley won't be ready for week 1, and they've already said he won't play in preseason games, so that has to throw some cold water on his stock for this year. Question isn't really, will he start for your fantasy team in week 1? The question is, will he start for your fantasy team at all this year? Trey Mason had a nice rookie year, and presumably he understands blitz pickup better than he did last year, so hopefully he can stay on the field a bit more. I know that's something of a cliche, but in Mason's case, it's really true. He really did come out almost every single time the Rams were in a passing situation in 2014. So my guess is that at some point partway through this season, Gurley will bypass Mason and maybe be a factor, maybe a big factor come fantasy playoff time. If that happens, he could be a game changer, but it absolutely might not happen, in which case he'll be a redraft pick that will feel like it's relatively wasted. Number 9 on the list, is Andre Johnson, the venerable Texans receiver who's now a Colts receiver. You could mention Frank Gore as well, because he's in a very similar boat, but I'll go with Johnson. Obviously all indications are that Johnson will be the number 2 guy behind Hilton. We all know that could be a valuable role. You just look at the total attempts. Andrew Luck's going to be over 600 if that offense continues to be what it was last year. If we give Hilton and the tight ends 300 targets, maybe even 350 targets, that leaves a huge slice of the pie available to other players. But Andre Johnson turned 34 this summer, and age is not just a number in this case. The tape wasn't all that kind to Johnson at the end of 2014. His long speed, that thing that made him such a dominator, being 6'3", 230 pounds, that long speed didn't seem to be there at the end of last year. Now, I've fallen into this trap before, and you never want to just say, oh, it's gone forever, right? You don't know for sure. You don't know what kinds of injuries he might have been nursing at the end of last year, but the simple fact is, if you watch him run, the separation that used to get him running right down the seam, busting past the corner that was on him, busting past the safety who would take a bad angle because they couldn't believe that he was as fast as he was, that burst just wasn't there. So we at least have to acknowledge the risk that Andre Johnson circa 2015 could be Reggie Wayne circa 2014. I mean, after all, this is pretty much the role that Wayne left behind, and even with all those targets and that possibility of production last year, Wayne had 64 catches, 779 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Not totally embarrassing, but not anything you wanted to chase for fantasy. And Wayne was 35, and as I mentioned, Johnson's 34. Dante Moncrief, and I also mentioned Philip Dorsett, they're there. They have tons of upside. It's no longer sort of a fading Hakeem Nicks anymore. There are legitimate options other than Johnson who could steal production if the worst happens and Johnson's fading. Now, I've painted this negatively. I have Johnson as my number 25 wide receiver, so it's not like I think he's doomed and he can't do this. I think probably, he's even higher than that in a PPR for me. I have him 22. Probably, if anything, I'm on the higher side of the spectrum of possible results for Johnson, but, you have to admit that, as for all of us, the abyss does lurk. The number 8 swing player for me this season is Jordan Matthews, the second-year wide receiver in Philadelphia. Good as a rookie, good numbers, 8 touchdowns, and he really filled the Eagles' need for a big slot man to create matchup problems for nickelbacks, to run the sort of underneath zone routes and be open a lot. Smart kid. But we should be clear that he was a slot man. That's what he was. I've got it right here. He ran 473 routes last year, 439 of them out of the slot. So now there's no Jeremy Maclin. Deshaun Jackson's been gone for a couple of years, so the Eagles are really relying on a bunch of unproven dudes on the outside. A rookie, Nelson Aguilar. Then you've got Josh Huff, Riley Cooper. What would make Matthews a lot safer and, give him more upside than, most receivers in the league anyway, would be if Chip Kelly decided to line Matthews up all over the place as a focal point. It doesn't seem like that's happened a ton in camp so far, but, who knows? And you don't want to rely on the portion of practice that's open to reporters, whatever. Things can change. If it were to happen, if Matthews were to be much more of a diverse weapon lining up all over the place, we're not going to know this until the real games start. But if it were to happen, I'd give Matthews a shot at a top 10 ranking right now, and certainly top 10 production. If he's still primarily a slot player, I think the floor is pretty safe. That can be valuable too. It's kind of a Marcus Colston thing, and we all know Colston was rock solid as a number 2 fantasy wide receiver for years. But in that case, Matthews might be somewhat capped from a yardage perspective, and he might need to hit elite touchdown totals to justify where he's going in drafts, where I think everybody has him as a top 20 option. He can do that. He can do it for sure. We just saw him do it last year. But as well as I know that chasing touchdowns is a dangerous game. So I do give the possibility of big upside, but the downside isn't terribly scary, but I can absolutely see a season where he is not worth what we pay for him in drafts. Number 7 is Cam Newton. And the big question with Cam, and the reason he's on this list is, will Cam run? Because for most of last year, he didn't run nearly as much as we wanted him to for fantasy purposes. He had one game of 50 yards rushing until December. Remember that game really well. It was against the Bengals. It seemed like he was back as a runner, and I know I started to rank him a lot higher, and it took him another 6 to 8 weeks before the rushing production picked up. But remember that he fractured ribs in the preseason last year, and he missed week 1 altogether. When he came back, the Panthers seemed to have instructed him not to take so many chances with his legs to preserve himself and make sure that he stayed out there. But the fact is that purely as a thrower, Newton isn't a top 10 quarterback. He doesn't have great weapons, and, he just doesn't have the quarterback skills to be that good with his arm. He has all the arm strength you could ever want, but when he throws the ball on a rope, his accuracy is not great. It's actually kind of bad. I find him completely capable of making read progressions. It's not that. It's just I question the accuracy and also sometimes the touch on his throws. Anyway, there's a reason he's maxed out at 24 touchdown passes in his 4 seasons. and has thrown double-digit interceptions every year. No, the reason we want Cam as a fantasy starter is, you know it, for his running. He's got 33 rushing touchdowns in 4 seasons. The question is, are the days of 700 rushing yards per season gone? And that's going to be the risk, and why Cam Newton is a swing player this year. If he stays healthy and decides that running 8 to 10 times a game is still in the playbook, my ranking of him as a 6th rounder or so in a 12-team league will look fine and maybe a little bit low. But if he's changed, if they're in a new era where he's being asked to throw first, second, and third and run fourth, yeah, whoops, he's probably not going to be a fantasy starter. And finally, number 6 is gotta be the player that I've spoken the most about this year on my podcast, on other people's podcasts. It's Joik Bell, who was a top 15 fantasy back last year. And from week 12 on, he was number 6 with a bunch of touchdowns mixed in. So, man, I'm still surprised how much hate he seems to inspire among experts and in fantasy drafts this summer. I'm not saying I don't understand the warning signs. He's coming off knee and Achilles cleanup surgeries. He's entering age 29, the age 29 season. The Lions drafted Amir Abdullah. So yeah, of course, I obviously see the negative of what could happen. I just think some folks are having problems seeing the positives of what might happen. They're looking at 3.9 yards per carry, and man, can I just again emphasize how little use I have for yards per carry as a lazy number? Anyway, people are looking at it and imagining some sluggish dude. He's not. On tape, I think Bell is a lot like Eddie Lacy. I've made the comparison many times. I think they're both plow horses. They make that, they're not like jitterbug guys, but they make that single hard, elusive cut at the line, and they get upfield. They both catch it really, really well. The idea that people are just handing the job to Abdullah seems crazy. It could happen. It could happen early. It could happen late. Absolutely. But Abdullah is one of those guys who I feel warned off. 5'9", 200-pound guys. We don't see a lot of them excel as feature backs in the NFL. When they get given that job, when they become feature backs, a la Andre Ellington, there's Gio Bernard, there's a chance they get hurt. Durability questions are real. The Lions have talked up Abdullah as a possible solution as their kick returner, which makes me think, maybe that's not our primary running back. And for as great as he was in college, and he was a great player in college, Abdullah was a fumbler. And all I need is to buy in on Abdullah and have him fumble week 1 and ride the David Wilson train to the bench. I'm not promising you Joik Bell will be a stud. That's why he's my number 6 swing player. There's no promise there. He might not be. Plus, he hasn't done much yet in camp. And if he winds up having, knee swelling or whatever later this month, I definitely reserve the right to change my mind. But assuming he's just a veteran who's ramping it up slowly and he's healthy for week 1, I'm a believer, and I think anybody who completely dismisses him as a possible fantasy factor is making a mistake.
Harris's Music Digression.
Thanks very much to James Petrali, whose nom de plume or nom de musique right now is Bop English. So when you're going to look for this song and look for this band, it's a one-man band called Bop English. James is a member of White Denim, a really cool band. This is a side project. This song is called Danny's Blues. It's terrific. The record is called Constant Bop. I wouldn't recommend it if I didn't really like it. I encourage you to download Constant Bop. Again, this is Bop English, and the song is called Danny's Blues.
today's guest.
And today's guest is Sigmund Bloom. How are you?
Great. This is the finger in the light socket feeling is back if you're in the football world, and we're still like a month away from the beginning of the season, so it's beautiful. And when everybody else starts to tune in, I mean, we never sleep anyway, but when everybody starts to join us, it starts to feel like a party.
Well, I got to be on your show for a full hour. This is not going to feel like, the full couch experience because we don't have that long, but I really enjoyed it, and I mentioned off the top that people should download it. The Audible podcast from footballguys.com. You should be listening to every episode, but for sure, if you like me and you like Sig, Hey, did you ever read that John Irving novel, Setting Free the Bears?
I haven't read. It's one of the John Irving. My book reading in the last 10 years has diminished towards zero.
I just want to call you Siggy because
that's fine.
Yeah, one of the main characters is Siggy. I just picture you like caterwauling around on a motorcycle or something.
What About Bob too? There's a Siggy in What About Bob that I remember being really excited as a kid. Like, wow, there's somebody with my name other than the Sea Monster and Freud.
All right, man. So what I've done so far in the show is count down 10 through 6 for my swing players for this year, and I thought it would be super cool to get a different perspective because some of the names I'm talking about on the show, people have heard me talk about, for the past couple weeks ad nauseum. So I want to get your perspective, and I asked you to assemble a list of 5 guys who you find to be fitting that definition of swing, right? That feeling of like, well, if they hit, they're going to be undervalued, but I'm worried there's a chance, the bottom could drop out too. And I was really surprised with the first name you gave me that Jeremy Hill is your swing guy number 1.
Sure, and I think part of the reason he is because he's a coveted player, a very coveted player. So now, especially with Arian Foster dropping out of that late first, early second round mix, you're probably going to have to take him in the early second to get him. And I think that the risk there is, unlike every other running back going in the top 10, he has a running mate that is also a relatively big side part of the offense. I mean, he's not as big a part of the offense as Jeremy Hill, but Giovanni Bernard is not a backup. He's not a peripheral back to this offense, particularly when the game script is Cincinnati is in a high-scoring game, a back-and-forth game that is requiring them to open up the offense, or perhaps a game when they trail. Then Jeremy Hill becomes marginalized. And you can look at weeks, I think, 10, 13, 14, the wild card game last year. He's getting 11 touches, 15 touches. And the other guys in that range, Matt Forte and Marshawn Lynch and C.J. Anderson and so on, you don't have that risk. In every game, they're going to be a core part of the offense no matter how the game goes. So a bet on Jeremy Hill is almost a bet on the Bengals, because if they win 11 or 12 games this year, you're probably going to be happy with Hill wherever you get him. But if they're a 7-9 and 8-8 team, then you're going to lose confidence in Hill week to week. Now, it's possible that they just decide, I know there's a narrative out there, well, Bernard's not really even that good, so they're just going to switch over totally to Hill this year. It's possible. I don't want to say that's impossible, but I wouldn't bet on that happening. Giovanni Bernard, I think, is a pretty solid running back. Maybe a 75% of Brian Westbrook kind of running back. So I think that if you like Andy Dalton to take a step forward, and hey, Marvin Jones is back, Tyler Eifert is back, you like Andy Dalton, and they do have a tough schedule this year. If you like him to be able to rise to the occasion in some of these tough games, then yes, Jeremy Hill could work out. But if they are a mediocre team because Andy Dalton shrinks under the lights, he shrinks in the big games, then you're going to start to lose confidence as Jeremy Hill, not even as your number 1 running back, like even in your lineup that week, if you feel like the Bengals are likely to lose.
So you put him in the Alfred Morris category.
Yeah.
Super game flow dependent.
Sure. Melvin Gordon, Carlos Hyde, Chris Ivory, Isaiah Crowell, hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah. Okay, so one-word answer if you had to choose in a draft between Hill and Morris.
Oh, I mean, I'm avoiding Morris. Oh my! I mean, Morris and Hyde are the type of running backs that, like, I don't want them in ADP. I mean, I'm sure I don't want them in ADP. But even in round 5 and round 6, if Morris and Hyde start to slide, here's something I think that we're really just starting to open our minds.
This is your version of a one-word answer?
God, I'm sorry. There you go. So you've learned everything you need to know about me, folks, if this is your first exposure to Sigmund Bloom.
No, so that's fine. So you say Hill over Morris, even though you have some compunction about it.
Not even close. No, and I think not even close. And I think that we're going to start to wake up in fantasy to the idea that at the end of a season, a running back can have 1,100 yards. But if half of those yards come in 4 games, they're not a very useful fantasy commodity.
I get it.
You know?
Mm-hmm. I do. I get it. Okay, so I think I'm a little more sold on Hill's floor than you are, but I respect that you're right, that the situation is different and he has a potential to be more game flow dependent. Who was number 2 on your list?
Arian Foster.
Yeah, that's a good one. Tell me why.
Well, right now I think Arian Foster is pure profit. I mean, I hear about people are asking me, should I take him in the 10th round? He's there in the 8th round. That's pure profit to me.
Yeah.
Because you don't even come close to, look, even if Arian Foster does not play a game this year, the proposition of potentially getting any share, now remember, the worst case scenario, as it has been defined by John McClain, among others, is week 10 on, okay? And yes, you have an opportunity cost of keeping Arian Foster and missing on a waiver wire spot. So, if it's a league where you have really short benches, like 3 bench spots, maybe that makes it slightly prohibitive. But we all know that Arian Foster on the field is an elite running back, fantasy-wise, and NFL-wise, any way you want to define elite. So nobody else from the 6th or 7th round on offers that. Nobody. If Arian Foster has a setback in his rehab and in week 6 you drop him, okay, so what?
Yeah.
But if Arian Foster, even if it takes until week 10, Chris, you and I, we've played fantasy and analyzed it long enough to know this. If Arian Foster if it's the worst case scenario, remember this is worst case.
Well, worst case is he doesn't. He comes back, but he's not the same.
Worst
case
scenario, as his recovery timeline has been outlined,
right,
is week 10. If he returns to week 10, and the thing is, John McClain qualified this with Arian Foster, when he plays, is ready to play. And Arian Foster has shown us that over his career. Like, he's very touchy about if his body's not ready, he's not going to play. But when he plays. He balls out. And
White stuff is anti-awesome, is that right? On the MRI, white stuff being anti-awesome?
Right. On his yes, and sharing his hands. Arian Foster is one of the coolest dudes in the NFL.
He really is.
Topic. I love the nonconformists. Always root for the nonconformists. So, but here's the thing. Like John McClain reminded us, he was coming back off of back surgery last year. In addition to all the soft tissue injuries and stuff he suffered during the season. So if Arian Foster hits the field in week 10 and is Arian Foster that we come to know and love, and maybe even he misses a game or 2 in there, but plays 4 or 5 of the last 7 games from week 10 to week 16, then everybody's going to wish they had drafted and stashed him. Yep. Everybody is. The teams that have him are going to have an unfair advantage.
I absolutely agree with you, and I have him rated 83rd in my overall ranks for standard scoring. I have him higher than that for a point per reception, which translates to exactly what you're talking about. 6th, 7th round. I think if he's there, you take him.
Yeah, and it's a winning. The worst thing that happens is you cut him, but a lot of people are going to take players in the 6th and 7th round that barely contribute to their team anyway, and don't have the opportunity to be a number. Now the upside of this is, and this matches up with what I've been hearing from Texan sources that I trust, that what they discovered when they did the hernia surgery was positive, or at least enough that the groin tear is one that you just don't heal. You let it heal itself, and you play through it. And he could return as early as like week 4, week 3, week 4, week 5. And not go on IR return. And if we even start to hear inklings of that, Chris, he's going to jump up to the 4th or 5th round.
Yeah. I mean, if that's going to happen, I almost want that news to come out the night before the draft. Because I'm going to own him.
Yeah.
There are leagues where I'm going to own him for sure. I'm with you on that one. Let's take a guy who is kind of in the opposite, I think, perspective right now. Despite the fact that Martavis Bryant has had an elbow issue and had to have a minor surgical procedure, is now back on the practice field. I think the Martavis Bryant hype train is still fairly full speed ahead. Despite Ben Roethlisberger saying Marcus Wheaton might be number 2, whatever. I think Bryant is valued quite high, but you see some shakiness. There's upside there because of who he is physically, and there's downside because why?
Well, the downside is just that, as Ben Roethlisberger, and I think some of it, you have to look at the words specifically that he said, I want to put that pressure on him. And there's a lot of coach and player speak at this time that is positive, that is really positive as almost a negative indicator in the sense that we are putting this out there, and it's the same thing as like trash talking in basketball or something, where you're trying to psych yourself up to that level.
It really is. That's that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, you want to challenge a guy to back up what you're saying on his behalf. But we saw Wheaton, and I liked Wheaton a lot coming out of Oregon State. And I was shocked at how poor he was as far as being on the same page and executing with Roethlisberger. But let's say worst case scenario, Wheaton clicks. Everybody who takes Wheaton from the 15th round on, congratulations. And I highly advocate Wheaton as a late round pick, because if he looks like he did last year, you cut him after week 1 and get a waiver wire pickup anyway. But if he doesn't, number 2 wide receiver and a great offense. I like that. And I'm even advocating going Bryant and Wheaton, and just, you're going to probably keep and count on one or maybe both if it's a number 2, number 3. But we already know that Bryant from last year coming in inactive for the first 6 games. Okay. So whatever they saw, they didn't even want him on the field in the first 6 games. Hits the scene, and by the second and third week he plays, Roethlisberger throws 6 touchdowns in each one of those games. Yeah. And we saw last year that he fluctuated greatly from week to week between being almost a wide receiver 1 level play at times and wide receiver 2 level play, and somebody that, 2 catches for 31 yards or 1 catch for whatever. So that's the floor. I mean, he's not going to be worse than that this year. I mean,
he's not going to be worse than 1 catch for 45 yards.
Well, but he's not going to. He's not going to
be worse than wildly varying. I totally agree with that.
Right,
yeah.
But that's like Torrey Smith. I mean, that's Brashad Perryman. That's players going in the 7th to 9th round. Okay, so that's the floor. The break, I guess, becomes if he backslides, or if teams start to try to take, and people say, well, they'll try to take away the deep ball. I mean, with Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell, I don't know how you prioritize Martavis Bryant over them, but okay. Right. I mean, I'm open to everything. I try to never say never. But on the other hand, he's showing up at 225, ripped and so on and so forth. But here's the thing about Martavis Bryant that people need to know. At Clemson, he was behind DeAndre Hopkins. He was behind Sammy Watkins, Jerron Brown, who's a tremendous athlete and player in his own right down in Arizona. And he was a late bloomer. I mean, he was a guy that honestly, until the second half of his senior year, you just wondered what was up with this guy. Like he's got everything you want athletically, and it's not there. I think he had a kid. He matured in that second half. I think the light came on. I call it the career near-death experience. Every player sometimes needs something to show them, football could be taken away, or you might have to be staring down the barrel of a very different future than the one you were envisioning. And maybe Johnny Manziel had that this offseason. We'll see. The point is that since then, everything that Bryant has done is consistent with a guy who gets it. If he comes, this is like Kelvin Benjamin, who I compared to Bryant in terms of the draft commodities they represented. Kelvin Benjamin comes in 10 pounds overweight and with a hamstring issue. He ballooned up to 300 pounds and things like that at Florida State. Bryant, on the other hand, comes in totally, rocked and ready. That tells me that he's gonna be at that upper level of his range of outcomes. And this is a first round level talent in one of the best offenses in the league. There's no way, as I said, I don't think there's any way Martavis Bryant is the priority for defenses when you have Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell and Ben Roethlisberger, who extends plays. I mean, Martavis Bryant, if the dust settles, Chris, and we see something like 65 catches for 1,200 yards and 10 touchdowns this year, should it shock anybody?
It shouldn't. The physical ability has not been a question since he got drafted, and I think you're right that the only way that NFL defense start prioritizing stopping Bryant is if he's had an unbelievably productive first half of the season.
Right. So you're psyched.
You're all right with that. Yeah. But otherwise, no. I mean, he's going to see most of your number 2 corner with a little bit of safety or linebacker help. There's some risk there also that if he sort of gets pigeonholed as the deep threat, that's where those erratic games come from.
Right.
He's fast enough to be a deep threat, but what's great about him is he's really big, and so he has the body to also be your flanker, catch it over the middle, rack up some good point per reception
he was
stuff
doing,
too. Yeah.
Last year he was running 2 routes. I mean,
That's
he was
right.
still extremely raw. Look, and I love Sammy Coates, and in the Pittsburgh Observer even saying Sammy Coates is ahead of where Martavis Bryant was at this point in Bryant's development. That should give you an idea of how they had just a little bit to work with last year and what they were able to do with that.
Yep.
It should get you excited about what they could do with more.
So number 4 in your swing player list, another one that I'm a little surprised about, but I guess I get it. I guess I'm not that surprised. I think the floor is safe, but Jimmy Graham.
My feelings about Graham are continuing to evolve, I guess. I think the original reaction to Graham was a bit of an overreaction. I think there was a lot of just math being done, right,
freakouts. You're not going to get Saints level production. How in the world? Russell Wilson's never going to throw that much.
Right.
80 catches is no longer on the table. That was the immediate reaction. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like there was a lot of like 75% of the targets means 75% of this, 75% of that,
Right.
and you're just automatically scaling it all down. Like this is what's going to happen with Jimmy Graham, and I think that was an overreaction. I do think that it just assumption of rational coaching, and this is where, but see, I'm starting to wonder about the assumption of rational coaching, because my thought was, come on, you trade your starting center and your first round pick, you're going to change things to focus on this guy. I mean, you don't just take the same offense and say instead of Luke Wilson, now it's Jimmy Graham. But that's what Darrell Bevell's saying.
Yeah, I don't care what they're saying. I don't.
I understand. I understand. Well, but the thing is, and I want to truck with you on that. You know that, hey, and Jimmy Graham is talking about 75% blocking, and even when he first said that, I'm like, oh, well, it may seem like that to him because he never blocked. But
what's 75% of zero, man?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But you know, again, they're saying like we didn't change the offense at all. Like Jimmy Graham keeps talking about blocking. He's also talking about like I'm going to take fewer hits and things like that. And the thing is, because of the stressors that Wilson. Because what I liked about getting Jimmy Graham is it's almost like putting someone in a wrestling hold where you have Lynch pulling up the players into the box. You have Wilson keeping players patrolling sideline to sideline and spying and things like that. And then you have Graham now able to stab up the middle with seam routes and otherwise take that big space that's vacated in the middle there and do a lot with it. So I could see him having fewer targets and fewer catches, but higher yards per catch, more big plays.
Tons of touchdowns. I mean, that's an offense that's going to be touchdown. You know, there are touchdowns there. I don't care if Marshawn Lynch is double digits. I think there's maybe double digits for Graham too.
Absolutely. However, the one thing that worries me is that, and I think what we want here is we want teams to be more competitive with Seattle as they were for the first 10 weeks last year. As long as teams are staying in close games with Seattle, I think it's fine. I do think that if Seattle is able to control games, they don't care about us. I mean, they don't care.
Oh no, that I'm with you. I mean, they have no incentive to say we paid this money, we paid this price for Graham. We have to make sure he produces this stats. No, that's not where they are.
So, and the other thing this is total soft-headed stuff. Okay, so
Cyborg, I'm not going to like this. You're telling me?
Well, maybe not, but you know, Jimmy Graham. The other thing is, it's so funny. It's so funny, Chris. Just as an aside, when we start to analyze players, really what we have is a big miasma or gumbo of all these different factors, and we're really trying to find out or guess is what's going to be operative. Because you can put together positive and negative narratives about every player.
Yep.
And then when we look back in January, we realize like, oh, this.
Well, we retrofit the narrative. We retrofit the narratives.
And often we at least pondered it in August. You know, it at least occurred to us that this might be the way it unfolds. Like, a really cool thing, John Evans from X's and O's, great podcast. I mean, I'm still bullish on Russell Wilson while we're on this topic, but he brought up something very, very relevant. He said, well, now that they paid Russell Wilson, are they going to have him run less because of the investment? I'm like, that's reasonable, It's
reasonable, but if they do it, the production goes way down because it's where most of his value, not fantasy value, it's most of where the NFL value comes from.
Sure. No, it's so anyway, as you start to think on Jimmy Graham, one of the things, if you've owned Jimmy Graham, that is in the second half of the year, he wears down.
Yep.
And it's not just, you can look at the stats, you might say, oh, but the stats are this, and this. But when you go back to the experience of owning him in the season, he's on the injury report. Oftentimes, there's wild speculation all the way from he's going to barely play at all to he's going to be just fine and in the similar role and they have no worries. And then you have to wait until they actually play the game to see, like, this week you got a 0. Oh, this week you got 2 touchdowns. Like, sometimes people are thumping their chest because I played Jimmy Graham, even though they said not to, and I got 2 touchdowns. And then sometimes it's like, oh, I got a 0. I got nothing. How many players are you taking in the third round that's a risk?
I hear you. Where do you have him rated overall?
I have him around the end of the third round, but every time I redo my overall rankings, Kelsey moves closer.
Okay.
And because of that, when I'm at that fork in the road, and honestly, there's so many running backs I love in the third round that it's hard.
You're not going to take them. You're not going to be the one who takes them.
Right. And even if all of those running backs dried up, and I was looking at Graham, I would be hesitant because then I would say, but I'm going to want to take Kelsey in a round or two, and I have them. I think Kelsey's ceiling might be a little higher than Graham's ceiling. I think his floor is close too. The thing about Kelsey, now I'm off on this tangent.
We'll go briefly on this tangent so we can
I'm
get
sorry.
going. Yeah, no, it's fine.
Yeah. Just, he was not cleared to run until a month before training camp last year. So when we were saying, why aren't they using him more? Well, that's why.
Right.
That's all in the past now.
It's funny. So just back-to-back, I'll get on to number 5 here, but back-to-back days, two people whose opinions I really, really respect. Yesterday, Andy Behrens said, I don't see Kelsey's upside. I'm not sure why. Folks, think that he could wind up as a top 5 tight end. I don't see it. And now you've got the opposite opinion with you. And that just goes,
where are you? Again, briefly.
He's my number 3 tight end, but I wouldn't consider him within a round of Graham, a little bit lower. So I think I'm literally splitting the baby between the two of you. But what's cool about that, and I think it's pretty clear, Kelsey could also be on this list.
Oh, yeah.
What's cool about that is there's good reasons to believe both sides, and it's not wrong. Until we see them play, we don't have the information. All right, so your 5th guy on your list is a receiver. I think all of us know that he has the ability to take a leap, but there are some very, very constraining factors in Houston. It's DeAndre Hopkins.
Yeah, and this fits perfectly into the discussion we were just having. Because no matter what DeAndre Hopkins does, at the end of the year, there's going to be some segment of the fantasy world shaking their finger at one saying, I told you that was what was going to happen.
And it could be the two wildly polls. It's going to be somebody who told you that one or told you that one. Yeah, that's great.
And really there's not much in between with DeAndre Hopkins. And I will say this, and again, Cyborg, you might not like this, but Hard Knocks, he literally, he didn't actually break D'Angelo Hall's ankle, but he hurt him, and they were trash talking with each other. And he was one of the talks of the first episode of Hard Knocks because he just looks like a guy on a mission. And I know this is Narrative Street and all that other stuff.
I'm glad you know what show you're on anyway. Yeah,
no, I get it. But man, the universe speaks to you in funny ways sometimes, signposts and things like that. And I had DeAndre Hopkins down in a tier with guys like Allen Robinson.
Wow.
Where I'm saying, well, because here's the thing. I'm trying to start a movement in fantasy football that we don't talk about wide receivers and tight ends, really. We talk about the quarterback to wide receiver combo or the quarterback to tight end combo. Then it becomes easier to have clarity when you're stuck between two players.
Yeah, and it's not good in Houston.
It's horrible. It's maybe the worst in the league because he has nobody to help him in that offense, as Chase Stewart from Football Guys put it. It's an expansion team level offense outside of Hopkins and maybe like a tackle and another offensive lineman.
Yeah.
It's terrible. Now, I know there's a lot of people running numbers and doing things like, well, if there's no one else to help, that means he's going to get 180 targets and so on and so forth.
That's the crutch argument. I mean, that is the crutch argument. You can't make that argument, surely, because there are cases where that happens.
Right.
But there are absolutely cases where it hasn't.
And Chris, I find that anytime people are throwing a bunch of disparate cases in a bucket to point to the next iteration that we're like the case we're talking about, that's always what the bucket shows us. The bucket shows us there's a wide range of possibilities. Okay, now let's start talking about where we think they're going to fall in that range. Just because the bucket says there's a 60% chance he'll be over this, that doesn't really tell us what's going to happen in the next iteration. All it tells us is the range of outcomes, which is wide for every player in the league every year. So 180 targets is great, but if they're not quality targets, if he's bracketed on every play, which seems to be, again, assumption of rational coaching, and especially going back to one of our other make-or-break players, Arian Foster. If Arian Foster is not there to force some sort of prioritization of defensive attention, then how does that work out? Now, DeAndre Hopkins might be good enough that it just doesn't matter, Yeah. He has the ball skills, the contested balls, winning in these one-on-one situations. It just depends. But if the defense is good enough, then I would imagine Bill O'Brien's going to march Brian Mallett or Brian Hoyer out there with them. Don't lose the game. He's just going to say, just don't lose the game.
I can't believe those names are the names we're talking about. At least in other situations, there's a young quarterback where you're like, well, maybe they could go to that guy.
Yeah. Tom Savage.
No.
So it's hard. It's really hard for me to invest a third-round pick. And I don't see Hopkins' ADP drop. And there's a lot of talk like his ADP might drop after Foster got hurt. I'm not seeing that.
No.
It's hard to invest a third-round pick on a receiver where, when you envision it as quarterback to wide receiver, it's Hoyer or Mallett too. Now, again, counter argument, Josh Gordon was just fine with Brian Hoyer.
Yep.
So I'm really in a knot on this, but as we talked about earlier, because in the third round, I'm looking for Frank Gore, I'm looking for Lamar Miller, I'm looking for Andre Ellington, It makes it easier for me because I never come to this crossroads. Now, for those of you that are insistent on Hopkins and you're drafting him because he's just a whale of a talent, and yes, he's in a position for a massive opportunity uptick. We'll see how good that opportunity is, but it's there.
That's right.
I get it. And those of you who are taking Hopkins in the third round and telling me, Bloom, you're crazy. You just take this guy because he can ball out and he's going to get a chance to ball out as a number one receiver. I mean, I get it.
That's why he's on this list. I mean, that's why he's a great candidate for this list.
He's the most pure example, I think, of this idea that in 3 weeks you could be flaunting to everybody that you took Hopkins, and in 3 weeks you could be wondering, should I even start Hopkins this week?
Yeah. Which maybe comes down to personal philosophy on how much risk you like to assume, because these are risky guys. But at least now we've sort of isolated some of these pivot point, these swing players, and given a lot more food for thought. And Sig, you are really fun to have on this show. I know you're coming back, right?
Oh, anytime. I mean, okay. As I like to say, I would talk to hear the sound of my own voice. Even if we didn't have audiences, I would probably do this anyway. But yeah, anytime. This is fun because I think this is one of those things where the audience out there, like, this is where we connect because these are the same things everybody else is wrestling with.
Right.
And it isn't necessarily to give you an answer like, do what I say. It's that, you have correctly gauged this situation. We've stared at it all off season and we're seeing the same things you're seeing.
Yeah. Tough. People should be following Sig on Twitter. He's at Sigmund Bloom, and for sure listen to his podcast because it's a different sort of spin on a fantasy podcast. It's not meant to be this, bite-sized, quick-hitting, just easily digestible. It's meant to be challenging and smart, and I find it to be that way every single time because you're a great host and you have great guests, the most recent notwithstanding.
Yeah, like you. And again, we'll be repeating that too. We're going to be making a lot of beautiful music together, Chris.
Awesome, Sig. Well, thank you very much for doing this. I'm so glad that you could, and great job.
Look forward to the next time.
And that's it. That's our show. Make sure you come back tomorrow where we will conclude our countdown of my top 10 swing players for 2015. We'll go 5 through 1. We'll have Cousin Josh on. Please remember, on iTunes, you can rate us and you can write us a nice review. You can also do so on any platform on which you download podcasts, whether it be Android, via Stitcher or TuneIn or anything. Please, it would be really helpful if you'd help other people find us by reviewing us well and even writing a nice review, because you read those reviews and you tend to believe them. People sound awfully sincere. I promise you that I am staying in Amherst, Mass tonight, although I have a feeling after today's podcast, pretty good chance we're going to get some reports that I have been elsewhere. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
The Harris Football Podcast's opening theme is Under the Gun by Apex Manor. The end theme is Tooth and Claw by OU Villain. Subscribe to the Harris Football Podcast on iTunes and never miss an episode.